Welcome to Bakken. A little introduction to this 12-acre place that my wife and I purchased in 1992. We moved here in the year 2000 actually, after 35 years in the inner city of Chicago. My ministry at that location had been classic inner city with people who were non-white and all kinds of people and all kinds of things that inner city pastors do. And also for many years I was a professor, and then Chicago was my laboratory for international travel, which I did for many, many years. But I grew up in this valley. I grew up about 3 miles from here. We still have a family farm and a homestead that we share and run with our cousins, and we use for ministries. But this place is a little bit special. And when we were looking for property, I saw this tree. This tree, I'd never seen a tree like this before, and I realized this was the Trinity tree. It has one trunk and immediately 3 branches, and for my wife Corrine and me, it's become the symbol of our place, for it introduces the idea of the Trinity of God, God the Creator, God the Redeemer, and God the Sustainer. And so the Trinity reminds us also that God is a God of beauty, and we wanted this place to be a place of beauty and celebration. And when it's blooming, the green at the base of this tree is actually white, and it flowers in white. It's white heather, and if you're in a liturgical church, you'll know that the Trinity color of theology is white. So that's planted in that way. The Trinity reminds us that we're never more like God than when we're in a relationship. The Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are partners. We get our theology of work from the Trinity. The Trinity was partnering in the creation and redemption of the world and continues to do so even now as they work in all the different cultures of the world. Mission begins with God, continues in Christ, and that mission was given to us as a calling. And so what I've decided to do is take a piece of this 12-acre place we call Bakken. By the way, when you put the N on our name, it means the. And so Bakke means hill. So we call this place Bakken, which simply means the hill. And on this 12-acre hill, I've made a mission trail. The trail is a little more than 2,000 feet long, and there are 20 markers on the trail, and we're going to visit them. These are ways to introduce friends of God who actually crossed mountains and deserts and jungles and oceans to get the story of God's love and forgiveness to the last peoples on the planet. And so I want you to know the mission begins with God, and it continues in the work of Jesus Christ, where we will go and see next. And then it continues in the human part, where 20 mission saints will be introduced on the mission trail at Bakken. So welcome to the mission trail. Well, as we leave the Trinity tree, we're reminded that Jesus once said, "As the Father has sent me, so send I you." So again, mission begins with God, it continues in Christ, and in Christ commissioned the church to take the message to the ends of the earth and to the end of time. And that's where it involves us. Now the mission trail moves to what I call the grotto. The grotto is a little room on the edge of the trail before we actually get into the 20 stakes of the mission trail. This is where I like to talk about the gospel. Before Jesus came personally, God communicated many different ways, through dreams, through miracles, through prophets and priests and kings. God spoke very personally to Moses and to Elijah and to others. But God realized there has to be a communication, a personal communication. And so the decision was made in eternity to send Jesus. And he could have chosen any DNA. He could have chosen any zip code. But most intriguingly, the Bible story is that he chose to identify with the Jewish people and be born in Palestine under occupation of the Romans and under taxation. And so Mary and Joseph had this baby, Jesus, in a borrowed barn in Palestine in West Asia. And almost immediately they became refugees, political refugees, if you please, international migrants. It's interesting, half the babies born in the world today are born in Asia. Jesus was technically born in Asia. Half the world's refugees today are Africans going from country to find bread. And Jesus became a refugee in Africa. So the Christmas story gets in touch with those events. But there's more. I want to take you into a grotto designed by Dr. Sam Gore. We have a sculptor. Dr. Gore used to stay with us in the summers to work in our son Brian's art camps with street kids in Chicago. And I asked him if he would design a sculpture of Mary the migrant. And he actually used a Lebanese girl to get a Middle Eastern face on this young teenager named Hannah. And so we will go inside the grotto and I will tell you a little bit more about Mary the refugee. The gospel means good news. And good news is the heart of the mission story. What are we saying when we go on mission in the world? Here's what I like to tell about Jesus. He was born in a borrowed barn. He became a refugee, eventually came back, and at the end of his life, died on a cross, but also was buried in a borrowed grave. If anybody understands the homeless, it would be Jesus. Or the migrant, it would be Jesus. But there's more. Herod, the king, was so jealous of the birth of this baby that he commanded that all the baby boys of Bethlehem be killed under the age of 2. Just think about it for a moment. Every boy in Bethlehem died for Jesus before he could die for them on the cross. If anybody understands the pain of crack babies or fetal alcohol, brain-damaged kids, HIV-infected children, all over the world who die for the sins of adults, Jesus would understand. His entire village died for him. Now, I didn't invent that story. I just took the stained glass off the infancy narratives of Matthew 1 and 2 and Luke 1 and 2. So I like to talk about Mary. Dr. Luke, who wrote the book of Luke, tells us that Mary pondered things in her heart. But you can imagine a young teenage mother pondering as she carried this baby from Asia to escape the tyrant and to live formatively several years in the area of Cairo, where if you visit, as I have done numerous times, they'll take you to the neighborhood where Jesus, as a little boy, grew up. The sculpture is here, and you'll notice that there's a red light and a blue light on the sculpture. That comes from my experiences in the Middle East. If you paint Jesus or Mary in the Middle East, except for Easter when Jesus is white, very often Jesus will be painted with a red undergarment, the red standing for God, the theology of color of deity. But Jesus will also have a blue overgarment because he became a human being. So a red undergarment because he's God, but a blue overgarment because he became a human being. But Mary is painted just the opposite. She's painted basic blue undergarment because she is a human being, blue the color of humanity. But because she is Theotokos, or as the Greeks say, the mother of God, she is clothed usually with a shawl or some kind of drape in red. And so to symbolize that, I've mounted red light and blue light to shine on Mary and to identify with those Christians who live in the Middle East who I love and who I visit almost every year. I celebrate their faith. They still live there under oppression. Palestinians and Arab Christians in Iraq and Lebanon and Syria and many other places. And they have lived with this Jesus. They understood the Jesus who was not born in a palace, but was born in a stable and became a refugee. There are hundreds of thousands of refugees from the wars in the Middle East to this day. And this is why the gospel is good news. God understood in communication how to communicate with the least and the last and the lost of this planet. Welcome to the grotto, and to Mary, the refugee, carrying her baby from Asia to Africa, as so many mothers carry their babies today. So, we started with the Trinity, and we came to the grotto to talk about the nature of the gospel, which is the heart of the Christian message. The message that God had come to earth in the form of a baby to identify with the human race, and then, of course, that baby grew up and lived sinlessly, and then became the Lamb of God, taking away the sins of the world on the cross, and then rose at the resurrection. And the earliest church was filled with the excitement of this message, that Jesus they knew came back from the grave. And so at Pentecost in Jerusalem, at the celebration called Pentecost in Jerusalem, the church was born, and it spread rapidly, mostly among ethnic Jews, but also ethnic Jews who were visiting Jerusalem, many of whom spoke other languages. They were from all over the Roman Empire. And among them was a young man named Barnabas. Barnabas was a Cypriot who, we read in the book of Acts, sold property he owned in Cyprus to buy land for the hunger offering in Jerusalem. Barnabas is mentioned 22 times in Acts, and while I think most people would have picked Paul to be my hero for the mission trail, and particularly for the first century stake, I've, for personal reasons perhaps, chosen Barnabas. Barnabas, the name Barnabas means son of consolation. Barnabas was a reconciler. He was a risk taker. When nobody would touch Paul with a 10-foot pole, because as Saul he had wreaked havoc and actually presided over the martyrdom of Stephen. The church feared him terribly, but Barnabas reached out to him and pulled him into the pastoral team in Antioch. Barnabas was the trusted person mentioned 22 times in the book of Acts, so I've chosen him. When Barnabas and Paul went on the first mission journey, they went out into the Roman Empire to tell the good news. And they took John Mark, a young colleague, along. Well, John Mark got tired of being a young missionary, I think, and maybe he got overstressed or maybe homesick, I'm not sure. But anyway, he left the journey and went back to Jerusalem. And of course, Paul and Barnabas continued the journey. But afterwards, when the planning came for the second journey, Paul didn't want Barnabas' friend and relative, John Mark, to go. When you look at Paul, obviously he needed a great deal of grace himself, but what you see is he really doesn't have a lot of grace to give to other people. Barnabas, on the other hand, took this flawed man, this young John Mark, and he went off to Cyprus and rehabbed him. And in one of the most amazing New Testament stories of reconciliation, Mark appears late in Paul's life and late in Peter's life to help both of them. Paul actually later on in Colossians says that, oh, welcome Mark. And then Papias tells us in a letter early in the 2nd century that actually Mark wrote Peter's gospel as he preached it. So this is a tribute to Barnabas. Barnabas didn't give up on this man, John Mark, and John Mark may have failed the first missionary journey, but he didn't fail the second one. He went to Alexandria, Egypt. He died as a martyr there, but he is considered today the founder, the father of the Egyptian church, called the Coptic Orthodox Church. And their big cathedral in Cairo is called St. Mark's Cathedral, and he's buried in the bottom of that church. And every time I'm there, I take my students to the grave of St. Mark. I want them to see the tomb, and I want to tell them about Barnabas, who didn't give up on this young apostle, and who mentored him even after he had his struggle and failed in the first mission journey. And so for him, I think he's a special moment of grace for me. A great evangelist, E. Stanley Jones, said, Paul was a truth apostle. Barnabas was a grace apostle. Now, they ought to be two sides of the coin in mission, but sometimes they come apart. And sometimes even denominations become rivals over truth questions and grace questions, as we sometimes see today, over who can be accepted in the church or who will be rejected by the church. But Barnabas is my hero. And so the mission trail, which goes 20 stakes now, which follows our commission by Christ, we're going to walk this trail right up to the 20th century. And about every 100 feet, we'll see a new saint. Saint number 1, Barnabas. Barnabas of Cyprus. Almost immediately, the church began to grow, partly because the apostles were thrown out of the city of Jerusalem fairly early by conflict. And they started going over the Roman roads and getting back on ships, some of them. They went to Asia, they went to Africa, and of course, eventually, they got to Europe. But one of the ways the witness took place was by martyrdom. And so for the second stake, I've chosen Polycarp. Polycarp was not the only martyr. There were many martyrs. Stephen was the first one, but there were many others, of course. Even John Mark was martyred. Peter and Paul were martyred at the end of their life. The word martyr, martyria in Greek, just means witness. And the ultimate witness is giving your own life in the calling and in the preaching or sharing of the good news of the gospel. Polycarp was a very famous pastor near Ephesus, in a city which still exists in Turkey called Smyrna. Polycarp in the 2nd century was well known. He had been a student of the elder John, the John of the book of Revelation, the John of the 4th gospel. He was well known to everyone, even in Rome. He had visited Rome. He had been inspired by another martyr, Ignatius, years before. But when he was 86 years old, actually, he was arrested by the proconsul of his area, and he was given the alternative that if he would just renounce Christ and denounce the gospel, he could be free. And instead, they tied him to a tree, or to a stake, and they laid the wood there, and they lit the fire, and they said they would put it out if he would renounce Christ. But Polycarp's witness was noted by people there. He said for 86 years Christ had been his Lord and Savior, and he counted it such a privilege to be able to share a moment of pain and suffering for the one who had given his life for him. Now, Polycarp's martyrdom was spreading like wildfire all over the Roman Empire. I could have chosen others, but he was probably the most famous. There were others who died in the at the mouths of lions. Blandina, many women, well, even nursing babies were thrown to lions. The church grew by martyrdom. It was said by one of the early apostles that the blood of the martyrs became the seed of the church. And that certainly has been true. What is surprising today is that there may be more martyrs in the world today, our studies show, than there were even in the earliest years. Well, as the gospel began to spread in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it spread in all directions from Palestine, which is a land bridge between 3 continents. It took the Roman road and went west toward Rome, and it took the Silk Road and went east toward China, Asia, and then it, of course, went south into Africa in a variety of directions. And when you come to 301, you have the first actual Christian country. There's some dispute about that. There are some historians who say, no, it's the second. Edessa was the first, but pretty much the consensus is that the representative of our 3rd stake, Gregory of Armenia, was the evangelist who went to Armenia, which is tucked up between Russia and Iran and Turkey, and is probably where Christians have suffered most throughout the centuries. An amazingly historic church. Gregory's may not have been the first Christian, obviously, there. Gregory's father, it seems, had committed a violent act, actually killed a previous king. So the family was refugees in Turkey, what we'd say Turkey, in Cappadocia then. But he came back. As a Christian, he felt called to his country, and he came back to Armenia. They put him in prison for about 11 years. He was in total darkness. But finally the king, Tiridates, was convicted by this, and he invited him out of prison, and he became a follower of Jesus Christ through the witness of Gregory. And Gregory is called the Illuminator because he brought the light of the gospel to the dark place and came out of this dark prison with the light of the gospel. I so admire the Armenians. You'll find them everywhere. You'll find their cemeteries even in faraway places like Bangladesh. I've run into the Armenians. Many of them were on mission in places that we don't even know about today. Many of them, those churches have long since disappeared under the oppression of Islam and other governments. But they were faithful missionaries. I admire these people. You'll find them in Iraq today. You'll find them in Iran. You'll find the Armenians all over the Middle East, in Beirut, and of course Yerevan. They've gone through a Holocaust back in 1915 when more than 1 million of them were killed at the hands of the Turks. But through it all, for over 1,700 years, this has been a faithful people. In the West, we normally talk about the Great Commission. We talk about it in horizontal terms, like go into all the world. For us, it's a one-generational kind of thing. Years ago in Cyprus, I heard an Armenian bishop say, for those of us in the Orthodox tradition, it is different, he said, than in the American tradition. He said, we were never allowed to travel like you people in the West, and we view the Great Commission differently. Instead of seeing it as a horizontal, let's go everywhere and tell people about Jesus, he said, for us it is, can we be faithful for 2,000 years? Will we be able to take the same message that has been transferred to us and give it to our children and grandchildren so that there will always be a witness to the gospel in this place? So which is it? Which is right? Is the Great Commission 2,000 miles or is it 2,000 years? When I listened to the bishop in Cyprus, I thought to myself, we need each other. I need to be reminded of that 2,000-year commission, that the gospel has to be delivered every generation. But also, we can partner with them because we do have the privilege of going all through the world, places they do not have to go, and we're unable to go. So I celebrate the third stake here, Gregory of Armenia. As we move from the third to the fourth stake, we're moving from Armenia, which you may remember is in the Middle East, north of Syria and Turkey, down to Ethiopia, actually. The story of the African church is a most intriguing one. Actually, Solomon had an affair with the Queen of Sheba and produced a baby they call Menelik, and so there has been a Jewish tradition of black Jews in Ethiopia for, well, 1,000 years before Christ, practically. And then you know that we have the Ethiopian eunuch who may have been a descendant of Solomon, who came and visited and was received with the gospel by Philip. But the story of the Ethiopian church has another taproot, and that's 4th century. It seems that 2 boys who were Syrians were captured off a ship that was returning for India. And the irony is it's happening off the coast of Eritrea or Somalia, where all these hijacked ships are happening today. The same thing happened there. The Ethiopians, who were running that part of the seacoast, captured him, and they took these 2 Syrian lads, Frumentius and Odysseus. They took them to Axum, the ancient capital of the Ethiopians. And they gave these boys the job of being the babysitter for the child king. Well, Frumentius had a powerful Christian witness, and he led this king to Christ. And from all the history, we know that the king actually became a believer. And he wanted Christianity to be respected, and he actually become the state religion. Now this happened about 323. The shipwreck And for 20 years then, Frumentius was there and planting the churches and working with the king to spread Christianity all over what today we call Ethiopia, which is a Christian island, by the way, surrounded by a sea of Islamic nations there on the heart of East Africa, north of Kenya and just south of Egypt and Sudan. Well, the fourth stake is about Frumentius. After about 20 years or 2 decades, he decided to go back home. And on the way to go back to Syria, where he hadn't seen any of his family, he decided to stop in Alexandria, Egypt, and he met the patriarch of the Egyptian church, Athanasius. And he told the good news. The good news was that there was a church now, and that the king was a believer, and the Christians were spreading, and it was a wonderful thing. And Athanasius refused to allow him to go one step further toward his home. He pronounced him bishop and sent him back to Ethiopia to be the bishop of the Ethiopian church. Today, in Ethiopia, there are about 35 million Orthodox believers. It is second to Russia as the largest of the Orthodox churches in the world. It's a church that has suffered. They have about 1,500 monasteries, about 500,000 priests, 11 training centers, and 2 seminaries, and no money. I go occasionally to Ethiopia to teach. And one of my colleagues, Jember Tefera, the wife of the former mayor of Addis Ababa, is a faithful, incredible witness to this. She actually is a descendant of the last emperor, the niece of Haile Selassie. Well-trained medically. She got her master's degree in community development, and then she did her doctorate with me. And I told Jember, I said, Jember, this stake is for you, to remind me that while Frumentius brought the gospel to your people, you have been faithful there in the centuries. You have been ministering all over the country and in the slums of this city, Addis Ababa. So I want to celebrate at this stake the living witness of the Ethiopian church. Now, the church is more than Orthodox. There are Catholics there, there are Lutherans. The Lutheran church has a huge following. There are many Mennonites there, Pentecostals, Baptists, and others, free churches. But the bulk of that witness for the centuries has been the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. And I want to celebrate that in this fourth stake. And this one's set up for Frumentius. Well, we've already heard that the gospel went into Asia on the Silk Road, got up into the north of Armenia, and then it went all the way south to Ethiopia. And of course the Ethiopian church sent missionaries, the Coptic Egyptians sent missionaries to other parts of Africa. And of course the gospel eventually got to Europe. Not for the first time in the century we're coming to, but early on, because the people who came to Pentecost came from all over the Roman Empire. And we're coming to the stake, the fifth stake that I have made for Patrick of Ireland. Patrick was actually born in Britain, on the west coast of Britain, and then he was captured by a Scottish raiding party, and he was dropped into Ireland as a teenager. And for about 6 years, he became a herdsman, just following sheep and other animals, and lived among Druids and others who were the faithful people at that time, non-Christian pagans basically. And but he even though he wasn't really a believer then, he became interested in the culture of the Irish, and they were amazing. It was a rural country on the edges of Europe, and particularly in the northeast and the southeast, it was very non-Christian. Well, he got away from slavery by jumping on a ship and getting away, and he ended up in South France. He traveled around Europe a little bit. He finally ended up in a monastery, and for 3 years he studied, and he really came to grips with mission. He decided to go back to England. There he said goodbye to his family, and he spent the rest of his life as a missionary in Ireland. And he literally is responsible for transforming Ireland. he really became almost an itinerant. Ireland had no big towns and big cities, and so there were no big ecclesiastical institutions. It became much more of a rural movement. The Irish Christians became known as the Celts, or Celtic Christians. They had a beautiful blend of nature and creation theology with their redemption theology. And at the same time, we're now in the 5th, 6th centuries, civilization of the Roman Empire was crumbling. There were attacks after 410. There were attacks by Huns and others on Rome itself. And the old Roman Empire, at least in the West, was crumbling. But the Irish came on just in time and, as one writer said, saved civilization. May have gone too far with that comment, but the Irish were fantastic. And so I want this steak to be in honor of Patrick, a kid who was taken by the Scots, dumped, became a herdsman, and eventually became a missionary back to that place where he had been dumped to be a herdsman, and became a great evangelist. And this is just a reminder that God uses all kinds of people and all kinds of situations to produce mission. I celebrate the Celtic Christian mission. And by the way, the Celtic symbol of the Holy Spirit is the wild goose. The wild goose can't be programmed. And the Irish have this beautiful symbol of a Holy Spirit that's out there in the world doing things off the map and comfort zones of Christians. That's very comforting to me. If you're on mission, knowing that the Spirit of God is out there before you get there, doing wonderful things in the culture. And so instead of going thinking you're bringing the Jesus, very often you go to find Jesus has already been there before you get there. The Celtic mission is very important to me. By now you may have noticed that all of these early missionaries were either Orthodox or Catholic. Truth is, our denominations that we have in the West didn't exist until centuries and centuries later. All of this should make us humble as we think of mission. These people were the ones who got the gospel west to our part of the world, and they were faithfully there long before we got there. And the next stake is one of those whose living legacy is going on significantly today. Benedict of Nursia was Benedict I, and the Pope in Rome today is Benedict XVI, who chose that name because he so admired this man named Benedict. Benedict, in 529, compiled some rules, and he published a book for monks called The Rule, the Regula, the Rule. And it basically was a way of organizing the life of monks, these people who used to live alone. The word monk comes from Greek mono, means alone. And monks often lived alone, but what he created was a community of monks. And by the way, you need to know that these monks were not clergy, they were lay people. And they were lay people who were coming out of a disintegrating Roman situation. And they were drawn by the economic opportunity of these monasteries. You see, what I admire about Benedict and the Benedictines was they didn't have any outside funding. They literally created businesses that would fund what they did. They planted flax, they raised sheep, they had wineries, vineyards. Basically, Benedict's followers planted about 300 of these monasteries in the toughest parts of Europe, where they taught the people how to organize. They'd get up in the middle of the night and have prayer. They would study, they would work in the fields, they would sleep, and this routine divided the 24 hours into hours of sleep and worship and work and study. They kept the gospel alive during that period we otherwise call, or here called, the Dark Ages of Europe. So Benedict I. Now the Benedictines were independent. They were not run by the central government of the church. The popes didn't have charge of them. And actually the Benedictines were so thrifty and so good at what they did, they ultimately became rich. And sometimes they became so rich and so powerful, they also got corrupted. And so later on, we'll hear about other kinds of monks that came along, partly to renew the Benedictine structures of the monastic movement. But there is no doubt that the roots of Europe, European civilization, go deep into the heart of these Benedictine monasteries. They copied the Bible by hand, which is why we now can print it. They preserved knowledge. Basically, universities came along much later in Europe, but the roots of the universities go all the way down deep into these monasteries, which were funded without any outside money. As we look at inner cities today, I've often thought we need the help of Benedict to learn how to do this in the most violent areas of the urban world today. I have been looking at how we could apply what Benedict learned in urban settings for a number of years now. And the good news is today there are a number of young Christians, and in fact there's a book out called The New Friars. There are people who are actually taking Benedict's ideas and they're going into the toughest places of America or the rest of the world and living as these people did. And this is a very new, exciting stage in world mission. So I give thanks to God today for Benedict I. Back when we were at the Trinity Tree, I talked about this, our place being a celebration of God, the Creator, the Redeemer, and the Sustainer, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is a good place to notice how creation works. God has designed creation in the most amazing ways. Here, for example, right by the sixth stake for Benedict is a tree. This is a nursing tree. The stump of the mother was here, and now the baby tree, which you see, is taking the nourishment of the mother and eventually will absorb that trunk. In my years here, I've watched it slowly take it away. And here's another one. This is a gigantic Douglas fir. This place was logged by the early loggers here that used steam engines back in the 1920s. This tree was left. I think you can tell it's a cut, it's a square cut. But also you can see a crack in there. I think that's why they left it. In the 20s, you didn't need imperfect trees, so they left it. But what's intriguing to me today is to see a fir tree suckling or giving nourishment to cedar trees. And so here are cedar trees, as well as ferns, of course, growing out and have their roots going down into this Douglas fir tree. So it is a hybrid of sorts. But it's just a wonderful thing for me to realize how God has created a forest in a way that can sustain itself. Most of the trees you see behind me, I've planted that row of trees. I have now a little over 3,000 trees. I've planted about 2,000 of them myself over the years. But I sometimes call it a Pentecost of trees. But we read in the Psalms, blessed is the man who's like a tree planted. And so I've just been watching these trees with great admiration and celebrating how God sustains and rejuvenates the forest. I really believe that we need to take care of God's creation, and that mission includes not only the salvation of persons, but also the redemption of places which have been contaminated by evil people over the centuries. We've been talking about Benedict, but now we come to the story of Islam. Muhammad died in 632, and within 100 years, Islam spread quickly around the Middle East, and it began in Arabia, but went all the way across North Africa, but within that first 100 years came up as far as Damascus. And the next stake, our seventh stake, will be John of Damascus. John of Damascus was born into a family in government, and his father actually encouraged him at age 12 to study Greek. And so he studied Greek, and he also studied Arabic. And that put him in good stead to be a person who would ultimately be able to engage and dialogue with Muslims and Islam itself, which he did. Islam was a challenge. Muhammad, of course, borrowed ideas from the Jews. He had noticed in the book of Daniel that Daniel prayed facing Jerusalem 3 times, so he said, let's face Mecca 5 times, pray 5 times a day. The Christians had Sunday as their special day. The Jews had Saturday, so he took Friday. Surprisingly, Jesus is mentioned in the Quran over 90 times. And actually, there are people in Indonesia that I have met who use the Quran in evangelism. Now, when I was in Chicago, I started counting mosques. I counted my first year 140, and then finally I realized, my goodness, there were over 240 mosques in Chicago. And many of them were in communities where white churches had been and fled when black people moved in. I think it's very critical today that pastors are educated in the Quran as well as in the Bible, because our kids are going to school with Muslim kids now. They live in the neighborhood. The mosques outnumber the synagogues in many historic urban neighborhoods now. Dearborn, Michigan is probably the Arab capital of America, but or maybe New Jersey is, maybe California is. Islam is everywhere now. And so what was studied far away in Damascus by John, we need to repeat. We need this witness again. John of Damascus, by the way, went away to Jerusalem to study. He was in the Marsaba monastery near Jerusalem for several years. He came back and began to teach, and actually at first he called Islam an Ishmaelite religion. That's interesting. He was in dialogue. He was also critical. When Muslims said, hey, the cross is an idol, he said, no, you should understand that our view of the cross is not an idol any more than your view of the Kaaba stone is an idol. So he really sought to communicate. And I think that's very, very important. And by the way, he's buried today in Damascus. And his church, the big church there, is now been incorporated into a mosque. But the presence of Christians were there, and they were in dialogue when Islam came, and we really need to recover that. By the way, he's written hymns, and in most of the modern hymnals, including the Lutheran hymnal that I copied, there is a beautiful Easter hymn, How Christ is the Light. It celebrates the resurrection. Eastern Christians, by the way, are very, very celebrative of Easter. Easter is their favorite holiday. In the West, we talk a lot about Good Friday and the cross, but in the Orthodox world, it's about Easter and resurrection. So I celebrate the seventh stake, John of Damascus. I welcome you to the eighth stake, and I'm sitting on a stump for a purpose. Boniface of Germany was a missionary who was sent to the frontiers of what today we would call Holland, actually Frisia, northern part, and other parts of Germany. And the Germanic people were violent, and he found at one point they had a sacred tree. So like Elijah of old, he just confronted the people of these other faiths, and he chopped down their sacred tree. I've planted his stake right in the middle of the stump of this tree here, so you can remember that. And of course, when the demons didn't attack as the people expected, they were so shocked that anybody would cut down their sacred tree and challenge the demonic. They actually decided he must be from God, and they would follow him and become believers. So he's well known for that. He is also a great organizer on mission, and he was called away from Germany at times to work in France. He helped organize the Pope, and others were highly regarding him. He became one of the great missionaries of Europe, according to many scholars. He was actually born in Britain, but I think he was 70 when he went on his last mission, and he went back to where he had started in the beginning, in Frisia, and he became a martyr in his last attempt, along with his friends. The word is that he challenged them and said, yeah, we're about to go to eternity gloriously. Our pain will be but for a moment, but we will be with Christ forever and ever. So I welcome you to the stake of Boniface. Today, I don't think we would be chopping down people's sacred trees, but there are certain aspects of mission and certain ways they did it with signs and wonders that happen through the history of the church, and the Holy Spirit somehow is able to choreograph all of these things to produce good even when bad occurs. There's one thing very clear in missions: you have to distinguish between the motives and the methods people use sometimes in world mission. And Barnabas is an example of my having to do that. I love his motive. I'm not altogether sure I would be chopping down people's sacred trees. So we'll move on to the Slavic mission. Stake number 9. As we move into the 9th and 10th stake, we're moving into the Slavic territories of Europe. There's a fault line, Eastern Europe being Orthodox and Western Europe being Catholic, and part of that happened due to things that happened in the next 2 stakes. I'm celebrating in the 9th stake 2 brothers, Cyril and Methodius. They were from Istanbul, or as it was called then, Constantinople, where Europe and Asia meet there on the Golden Horn. And these 2 boys were highly knowledgeable because they knew the language of Greek, but they also knew the Slavic language and had an ear for languages. Sometimes you remember the word Yugoslavia. Yugo just means south, and so Yugoslavia means the South Slavs. You have the Russians in the north, but there are many other Slavic groups in the south. And these 2 boys went on mission, and they went to the area today we would call the Slovak Republic, or what used to be Czechoslovakia, the eastern area, the area where the Moravian brothers came about later. And these 2 brothers were amazing. One was a preacher par excellence, the other a translator. And the Russians did not have, or the Slavs did not have, a written language at the time. They had to invent it. And so they took the Greek capital letters, called uncials, the capital letters of Greek, and invented the alphabet for the South Slavs. And they translated the Bible. Now, Cyril died early on. Methodius was actually put in prison for 3 years. His sin was translating the Bible into these peoples. But that tells you something also about mission. When Islam comes to an area, the main language is Arabic. They introduce it, and you really, to become a first-class Muslim, have to get into Arabic. But because Christians believe in the Holy Spirit, and Pentecost was so important, especially the Eastern churches also believed God spoke local languages. And so gospel translation has been very important. And these people are tremendously important. The Russian alphabet today is called Cyrillic. And when you talk to people in this part of the world, as I have done, in reverence and respect, they celebrate Cyril and Methodius. A couple years ago, I had the privilege of going to the place in Slovak Republic where they ministered, and I've studied about it, and I just celebrate the way God moved the mission into the Slovak world. If it had not happened, Islam came through, of course, later, and that whole area today would be Muslim for sure. But the church was planted there thanks to faithful missionaries like Cyril and Methodius. Now we move up to the 10th stake. Not only are we halfway through the mission trail, but we are introduced to the Russians. And I want you to meet a woman named Olga. Olga. Sounds Swedish. Truth is, she was Swedish, but she became a queen of Ukraine. And Kiev, the capital of what was then Ukraine and Russia, was important for her. She is going to be part of our next story. Well, as you can see from here, the trail is winding, and that certainly explains how the gospel got to Russia. There were, of course, missionaries before the story I'm about to tell, but the Swedes, the violent Vikings, of course, could never stay home, and they discovered these rivers that run to the north and south in Russia, and So in the 9th century, the Russians had been invaded by Swedes. Basically, they came as traders, and they traded up and down the famous rivers, and they came to the area of Kiev. And Olga, who is called Olna in Ukrainian, ends up marrying Igor. Now, Igor sounds pretty Russian to me, so you have a mixed marriage. And Igor died, and Olga literally became a queen for about 19 years in the Ukraine. She was a Christian. In fact, after or late in her reign, she decided to go to Istanbul and be baptized by the patriarch. And apparently she did, and she came back. And through a long story, very complicated, her grandson, Vladimir, also a Swedish name, Waldemar is Swedish, Vladimir in Russian, announced in 988 that he had decided that Russia would be a Christian nation. Now, for a variety of reasons, both holy and unholy, he couldn't accept Islam. He didn't want to give up pork and fasts and all those things. And he certainly wasn't happy with some of the other religions. There is also some truth, some say, to the idea that he did send teams out to explore other faiths. One of those teams actually went to St. Sophia Cathedral in Istanbul. And when they came back and reported to the king, the story says, perhaps a legend, but nonetheless an important one, that they had been in heaven when they were in the Christian church. Well, whatever the motive was, Vladimir needed a religion to unify the very diverse Russian peoples. So in 988, he announced everybody to get in the river, and in a mass baptism, Russia became a Christian in one day, as it were. Now, that's one way to do mission, and we smile on that today, but the truth is, it stuck. Back in 1983, I was in Anchorage, Alaska, and I was visiting Bishop Nicholas of the Orthodox Church of Alaska. And I asked him about the church in Russia. Has it been compromised under communism? And he said, well, of course. To survive under Stalin and Khrushchev and others, the top of the church had to make deals. But he said, not the babushka crowd. That is the poor mothers who wear those bandana scarves. They are the backbone of the church. Then he said this to me, and I will never forget it. He said, in 5 years, everybody in the world will know who the real Russians are. He said, in 5 years, the Russian church will be 1,000 years old. The celebration has already begun. He said, and we will be able to say this, communism has been here for 70 years. Christianity has been here for 1,000 years. I only had a meal one time with Billy Graham. We were both speakers at Urbana, a missions conference in 1984, speaking to about 18,000 students. He listened to me, I listened to him. We had dinner one night with Gordon MacDonald, and we were talking about his recent return from Russia. What he told us was there was a revival so deep and so wide, the Russian church didn't even know, the government in Russia didn't even know what to do about it. I think this is one of the miracles of our time. I want to give thanks to a Russian church. I happen to believe in adult baptism. I'm a little leery of marching your horse into the baptistry and baptizing the whole country at one time, but I have to give thanks that the baptism stuck, and that the Russian Orthodox Church, in spite of many problems, has been faithful and witnessed under pressure, and enormous pressure, under the czars and under communists, and I thank God for them. So the 10th stake on the trail is for Olga the Swede, or descendant of the Swedes, who married into the Russians as a Christian, influenced Vladimir, her grandson, to become the first Christian emperor of Russia. Well, the trail gets a little rocky here, and that's a parable, really. As we move into toward the 11th stake, we're definitely moving into a cataclysmic time in Europe. Some call it the Dark Ages. But actually, the darkness is mostly in our minds. It's what we don't know about the period. But in 1066, William the Conqueror conquered England, and he had a scholar named Lefranc he brought over to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. There was a new pope then named Gregory the Seventh, and he was formerly Hildebrand, and boy, he had renewal. He wanted celibacy of the papacy, and he wanted to stop having secular people appoint bishops. So the politics between the church and the governments was in a hot spot in Europe, and it got worse. The Archbishop of Canterbury finally ended up being a guy named Anselm, and I've chosen him for the 11th stake here to represent this period. Anselm was actually a monk in France, and eventually he became the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. He did a lot of scholarly work. The reason I've selected him for this is I consider him a patron saint for campus ministers. By campus ministry, I mean people who work with students who are wrestling with the faith. Anselm was one of the first who felt that faith seeks understanding, that you have faith, but you really want to know more about the mysteries of the faith. Background. He was one of the first ones to use logic, called ontological arguments, to try to prove that God existed. He wrote a magnificent book called Why God Became Man, Cur Deus Homo. He wrote Proslogion. He wrote books about how to take reason and turn it into faithful witness. So he becomes important at the time when universities are being established in Europe. Oxford and Cambridge, these new schools, Paris, Bologna, universities were popping up out of the cathedral schools in the new urbanizing environment of Europe. And so Anselm for me represents a tradition in the church of using scholarly arguments to assist faith. And that has been involved in mission all over the world. So Anselm has to get some credit for that, and I honor him with this choice. I've met many campus ministers who are working on campus, which is a huge mission field, and trying to make sense of faith to intelligent students is a big challenge many times. For myself, Darwin, Marx, and Freud were a pretty stiff breeze at the University of Washington, and I can appreciate those people who have been apologetically oriented, who help us understand that faith also can make sense through historical studies and apologetic studies. Anselm has many descendants even in this day and age. The 11th stake, Anselm of Canterbury. Well, we're on the trail today. I'd just like you to imagine in January when I bring my doctoral students here and there's 8 inches of snow on the trail. That's happened the last few years. It's not quite the same, believe me, when they're climbing through, especially my African students who've never seen snow before in their whole life. We're climbing up the trail to get to the stake of Bernard of Clairvaux. And in coming to Clairvaux, we come to a different kind of monasticism. Back when we talked about Benedict, I talked about how these lay monks were organizing independent monasteries all over Europe. But I also mentioned that as they began to inherit land and wealth, they also became corrupted. And that happened in many cases. One day, a 23-year-old showed up at a monastery called Citeaux in France. His name was Bernard, and he brought all his friends. About 30 people came to the monastery, and they all wanted to be monks with him. It's obvious right away when you look at his life that his influence extended beyond his intellect. He was, of course, a phenomenal preacher, but he was also an incredibly powerful personality. And at age 25, he was literally asked to go and start another seminary or another monastery, which he did at Clairvaux in France. And he had many important students and many influences, one of which became the Pope. And the Pope wanted to have a crusade, the Second Crusade. And so he got his former teacher to come and support it. He wanted him to go all over Europe and preach about the crusade. Now this is where it gets a little tricky, and where I need to tell some truth about somebody that I admire a lot. He was a great preacher. In fact, he awakened the stale faith of thousands all over Europe. But power also corrupts, and one of the things that got, I think, into trouble, first of all, he wanted to become a missionary to the Middle East. He actually made a trip there and gave a witness to a leader in Egypt, but it didn't work. He came back somewhat disillusioned. But his support for the Second Crusade was a terrible blow on two accounts. First, the Muslims defeated the Christians and hated Christianity even to this day because of the damage the Crusades did to the Middle Eastern people. But also it devastated the Eastern churches. The Eastern churches were not understood by the Crusaders, who were Catholics, and when they got over to the Eastern churches, they saw them as Orthodox, and they literally burned them, they pillaged, and they so weakened the Eastern Church that many point out that was probably more serious damage than the damage to Islam. But Bernard was a mystic, great preacher. He used to preach in convents, and there are great legendary stories about that. But he also wrote hymns. One of my favorites is the hymn for Good Friday. Listen to this verse, because it says how this man feels. You can feel his passion for Jesus Christ. It's unexcelled. He wrote it in Latin, but it translates even as well. What language can I borrow to thank thee, dearest friend, for this thy dying sorrow, thy pity without end? And make me thine forever, and should I fainting be, Lord, let me never, never outlive my love for thee. As we move toward the 13th stake, we come to a new chapter in monastic life in Europe. And by the way, the Eastern Orthodox churches had monks and monasteries too, but they were more mystical, and often the monks stayed put and developed centers of scholarship and piety and so on. In the Western Church, the monks tend to be more missionary, more aggressive economically. They developed scholarly and university lives, and we're going to see that there's more than one type of monasticism. I mentioned Benedict. I sometimes call the Benedictines Baptists because they're independent, like Baptist churches. A single abbot runs the monastery. When you get to our last stake, to Bernard of Clairvaux, you have what I call Presbyterian monasticism. What I mean by that is they're connected. It's like a denomination of monasteries. They all report to a common leader, much like the Presbyterian denomination, which has its connectedness. When we come to the 13th stake, we're coming to Francis of Assisi and a contemporary Dominic. And we get to what I call the mendicant friars, the beggars, because the other monasteries had become wealthy, landowning, very often corrupted by their wealth and their political intrigue. Francis represents a new style, and I want to talk about him a little bit. In the year 1206, he became a believer. He was an Italian playboy, actually. He actually went off to war. If you can imagine him wearing a knight's armor suit, he went to battle against a neighboring area, Perugia. He was actually taken prisoner and for 1 year spent time in prison. He came out and he had a tremendous vision and came to see the risen Christ in a most unusual way by looking at a person in the road who needed help. And his father was very upset with his Christian conversion. His father expected him to pursue wealth and fame and education, and his father used to complain, in fact, to the bishop and say, "Speak to my son, he's ruining his life." And in one serious altercation, right in the middle of the town, His father says, "Look, I've given you the very clothes on your back, and what have you done for me?" And Francis stripped naked and said, "Father, you can have them." And he walked out and became a hermit. And later he began, of course, rebuilding the church in the town, and then people came to him, and a movement was born, and they became the friars of the two-vow monks. It took time before the Pope recognized them, but that happened. Now, Francis is usually shown, as we have a sculpture here, with birds, because he preached to the birds. He really believed you could not renounce the world, as all monks were supposed to do. So that's why they became two-vow monks. They didn't renounce the world. He believed in all of God's creation. Well, about the same time, there was another Dominican scholar, today we call him Dominican, Dominic. Dominic was Spanish, brilliant scholar. He came to the Pope, the same Pope, Innocent III, a few years after Francis, and he said, "Your Holiness, I have an idea. You see, for me, theology is loving God with the mind. I would like to build universities and faculties of theology to train preachers to probe the mysteries of Christ." The Pope said, "God bless you, my son, go for it." So the Dominicans were born to go out and plant universities, where Francis' theology was faith, active, and love. He had come to the same Pope and said, "Your Holiness, I would like to take the gospel to the streets and to the poor." So I often ask my students at the stake, as we're contemplating Francis and Dominic here, which is it? Is theology loving God with the mind, as Dominic said, or is it faith, active, and love, loving the poor on the streets, as Francis would say? The students try to say, well, isn't it both? And I say, well, is there a verse about that? And then somebody usually remembers the great commandment that Jesus said. Mission has the Great Commission, but we also have the Great Commandment. The Great Commandment is in Matthew 22, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second is love your neighbor as yourself. In one sense, the first commandment is pure Dominic, and the second one is pure Francis. At its best, the Catholic Church holds these two together, and they become reforming impulses in the history of the Catholic Church. Unfortunately, in Protestant tradition, probably Francis and Dominic would have become rival denominations. But at this point, I like to tell the students the importance of balancing our theology. I really believe that if you just have Francis and you're out loving street people, you'll burn out, and your piety will become moralistic. But if you just have scholarship, you just have Dominic, your scholarship will become arid scholasticism within a generation, and you'll burn out mentally. So the sustainability for mission, seems to me, is when we put Francis and Dominic together and we hold them in tension, as the Great Commandment does. Love the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. These are two sides of the coin in mission. On to the 14th stake. As you see, we're continuing to climb up into the high Middle Ages, and soon we'll be at the place we call the Reformation. Well, we're on our way up to what I would call the terrible, terrible 14th century, the 1300s. It was a period of the 100 Years' War. You may recall that between 1348 and 1351, actually 1/3 of Europe died of bubonic plague. I think it's fitting that we've left a little of the jungle to beside us to remind us that we were walking through bad times. There were even two popes for most of this century, and for 100 years the French and the English were at war with each other. If you want to get a good picture of this, I recommend a book by Barbara Tuchman called A Distant Mirror. It is an amazing historical background. It's called a pastiche, really, study of the 14th century, and she compares it to what a nuclear winter would be today, or an international pandemic of an AIDS proportion if 1/3 of the people died. Now, there are a number of people who could be qualified as the missionaries of the time. John Wycliffe would be one. But I've decided to call name the 14th stake after a Spanish person, actually Ramon Lull from Majorca. Not as well known as Wycliffe, but because of the impact of Islam today, I think a very, very important missionary. In fact, Ramon Lull from Majorca. Majorca, you may know, is an island off southern Spain. And perhaps you know that for hundreds of years, literally, the Catholic Church was pushing the Muslims out of Spain and Portugal. In the Islamic march into Europe, which came from both sides, by the way, up the Danube on the east and up the Iberian Peninsula, they almost got to Paris before they were stopped at the Battle of Tours, just outside Paris. And then Islam was pushed backwards. And it was a violent time. Christians just forcing the people they called the Moors, or today in the Philippines they're called Moros, but these are the Muslims. And so when Majorca was liberated, to make a long story short, another playboy became a believer. Raymond, saw images of Christ in his dreams, and Christ was always wounded and appealing to him. And he finally realized he had a calling and he had to respond to Jesus. And so he did. And he became an incredible scholar. He wrote about 60 books in his lifetime. He traveled all over Europe. He actually hired a Saracen Arabic-speaking person to teach him as a slave, to teach him Arabic. And in a conflict with this slave, he actually hit him. The slave hit him first and he hit back, and the slave committed suicide. And that had such an impact on Ramon Lull. He decided to become a missionary to Africa. And he also decided that you could never reach Muslims by violence. It would have to be done through love. And that became a message. But one of the things that's really important about him is he introduces the idea in missions that to understand evangelism, you really need to go back and study the ancient languages. And he went to the universities that were being founded in Europe, and he told them, you have to teach Hebrew, you have to teach Arabic, you have to teach Chaldean, which is what they called the old languages of the Arabic world, the Syriac world. So he's famous for that. He's famous for convincing these schools to offer the biblical languages. He really felt that to become a missionary, you have to get to know people. He made, I think, 4 trips to Africa, to North Africa. And finally, at age 70 or so, he became a martyr in Africa. He had been hidden first while he served the Christians there. He pastored them and encouraged them. And then finally, he gave himself up to the authorities and went out to face martyrdom. Samuel Zwemer was a very important 20th century missionary to Muslims, and he became a great professor at Princeton Seminary. And Samuel Zwemer is the one that I and many owe great honor to for translating and for recruiting all of these studies that have to do with Ramon Lull. He's not that well known. Many people write and ignore him altogether. But I want to honor him as one who teaches us that Islam will never be won by crusades, by military might. It's got to be by love. He believed that. And also the importance of knowing the languages as a part of mission. So remember the terrible 14th century. It could have been John Wycliffe we celebrate here, who did phenomenal things. But I'm reminding you to remember Ramon Lull. Now we're going on to the Bohemian Reformation, to Prague, and to the Council of Constance, and to another martyr. As we move into the 15th century, it didn't get better in a lot of ways. We have conflict all over Europe. Constantinople fell to the Turks. Many Eastern scholars flooded into the West. There were multiple popes and rival popes, and corruption was everywhere, and everybody knew there needed a reformation. And I want you to know that Luther didn't invent reform. In fact, the Reformation was a harvest, as Heiko Obermann, one scholar, says. It was happening during the High Middle Ages in a number of ways. And you can see that just on this trail. John Wycliffe was active in at the 13th, or what we say 14th stake, 13th century. And his writings and his speaking spread to Prague because a woman from Prague married into the English royal family. And so a lot of students from Prague were going over and hearing about Wycliffe, and they brought his message back. And there was a preacher in downtown Prague named Hus, or Huss, we sometimes say. John Huss, or Hus, became preacher at the Bethel Church, and he became also a professor at the university in downtown, what today is Prague in the Czech Republic. For about 10 years he was pastor and also professor. And he was working with Wycliffe's ideas, and he really was trying to get the church to be renewed. And of course the local political people and some of the Catholic leaders were very upset with this movement and with him personally. And they were calling a council to meet at Constance in 1415. And at that point, they invited him on a safe conduct pass to come and present his views. Now, when he came, they decided he was a heretic. And so they immediately canceled his safe conduct pass, and they literally burned him and a colleague at the stake. And then, because they didn't want his grave to become a memorial, they scattered his ashes in the lake so they wouldn't be remembered. But of course, martyrdom being the seed of the church, his movement spread by wildfire, and spread through Prague, Bohemia, Moravia, and this area, eastern Germany, became a hotbed for the Brethren movements that come up after the Reformation. The council was interesting. You know, the council reminds me that there was no one way to reform the church. There were half a dozen ways. Some people like Savannah Rowland, Billy Graham say evangelism is the way you reform the church and society. Erasmus of Rotterdam and many seminarians today would say, no, education is the way. Educate the leaders, the preachers, and then reform will come. Others, like the Queen of England or the King of England or Cardinal Jimenez in Spain, will say, no, we need government assistance. We need to get better people on the Supreme Court, or we need to get our point of view in Congress. People who believe that are just like Henry VIII and Cardinal Jimenez. It's basically the idea that the church can't reform itself. It needs government assistance. Well, there were people like John Garçon, Henry Dailly, and Henry of Langenstein, people like this that you never heard of, and you don't have to remember their names. But they were sort of the Peter Druckers, I call them, of the 15th century or 16th century. They really believed that the church had too much corruption at the top, and they needed to spread the corruption out by better management in the church. And so the idea was, we'll call councils, and councils will set up better action plans, better management plans. We'll get the church organized better, functioned on in ways that are more biblical. And I honor that. I believe there's some truth to all of that. I mean, how many of us pastors today go to these management conferences and come back with some pretty good ideas? There were other groups like the Anabaptists who said, I'm sorry, the church can't be reformed. Let's bail out and start new ones, or get back to the first century primitive model of the church. Then there were others later, like the Jesuits, who came along and said, look, let mission reform the church. Let's forget all this internal stuff. If we just focus on world mission, the reform will come. Now, I've just shared very quickly a half a dozen ways that were being argued you should reform the church. The Council of Constance, the council met at Basel and Ferrara and finally in Trent. And the attempts of these councils were to try to spread the corruption and organize the church into better structures, more faithful, more biblical, more sound. And again, I honor them, but one of those councils was used to burn him at the stake. Now, by the way, years ago I had a brush pile here, and I put his stake right here in the middle of the burn pile. You can't see it now, but right over here is a tree. And one day that tree in a storm uprooted, and it came down and smashed the stake clear into the ground. Poor old John Huss. He's been dead, but he still gets persecuted. Even on this trail, the tree literally destroyed the previous stake, drove it right into the ground, so I had to get a new one for him. I admire Huss very, very much. Now we move on to the 16th century, the period we call the Reformation, and I will introduce to you another person. And maybe surprise, if it were a ministry trail, I think my choice would be Martin Luther. But missions goes beyond the boundaries of the parish. The Protestant Reformation more or less worked inside the church as it existed. At that time, the Catholics were doing global mission. So I want to introduce the 16th stake. Well, welcome to All Saints Chapel. This is the 16th stake, and Bartholomew Las Casas is my hero for the era of the Reformation in terms of mission. As I said, if it were a ministry trail, we'd probably call this the Luther place. But it's a mission trail, and the people on mission in those days were Catholics, and Bartholomew Las Casas was a Spanish missionary who went to the Caribbean several times. He ended up crossing the ocean 4 times as he was a missionary in Mexico and Cuba and other parts of Latin Central America. And a very, very important time of conflict. At that point, Spain ruled Europe, and essentially Spain ruled the world. The King of Spain was also the King of Europe, or the Holy Roman Emperor. And Charles V was the first of those great emperors. He actually ended up having to deal with Luther in the north, Turks in the east, as the Turks were trying to conquer Vienna. And then on the west, he had to deal with Las Casas and Sepulveda. Sepulveda had just translated Aristotle's book Politics into Latin from Arabic so it could be read and studied at the universities. Aristotle taught that some people were naturally born slaves and didn't have souls, and those people included the Spanish Indians that had been discovered by Columbus and his successors in the New World. Now, there was a group of people in Spain called the conquistadors, and they basically said over a period of 100 years to the Spanish people, you give us your land and your gold, and we'll give you the gospel. We'll give you Jesus, and you just give us your land and your gold. And that's superficial, but that's exactly what happened over a period of 100 years. Las Casas came back to Spain and was horrified to discover that the conquistadors had bought into Aristotle's idea and were presenting it to the kings, first Charles V and then Philip II. And so there was a great debate in the late 40s and early 50s in that century. While Luther was still alive, this debate was raging in Spain. How shall we treat the new Indians? Las Casas is a hero of mine because he truly believed the Latin Americans, the people today we would call Mexicans or Cubans, are people. They're real people. They have souls. They should be evangelized. They should be discipled and made into ministers and ministries. They should not be ruled by encomienda systems that were designed to rule them through the sacraments. Some have said, as John Mackay wrote, that the Spanish people felt that there were only 2 images of Jesus that you should present to the Latin people. The helpless Jesus in the mother's arms, or the emaciated Jesus on the cross. Those 2 pictures of Jesus would convince people that Jesus should be worshipped, and that was okay. But they didn't want anybody to know that Jesus would offer empowerment. And so one of the things that happened in Latin America is that the Spanish missionaries very often gave only part of the picture to the people. And so in the 16th century, I'm celebrating Las Casas. Las Casas, whose name in English would mean houses, Bartholomew Las Casas, who believed in the humanity of these people. Now, the United States has become the second largest Spanish-speaking country. And we passed Spain itself, Argentina, Colombia, and only Mexico has more Spanish language speakers than the United States. And if you look at what's happening, Mexico will be here tomorrow. I think it's very important for us to, especially Protestants like me, to recover the stories of these heroes of missionaries who told the truth. Las Casas is one of those who told the truth. I celebrate him here in the 16th century. Well, the Reformation of the 16th century unleashed other reforms as well. There were two very well-known and somewhat contrasting reforms, one in England and one in Germany. In England, you've heard of the Puritans, I suppose. The Puritans were attempting to de-Romanize or get rid of the Romishness of the Catholic Church in the Anglican communion. And at the same time, there was a 30 Years' War in Germany, and it spread beyond Germany a little bit, up and down East Middle Europe. But basically from 1618 to 1648, you have the 30 Years' War going, and after the war ended, Germany's population had gone from 16 to 6 million people. And many people were saying, it's Martin Luther's fault. He caused this, God's judgment on Germany. But there was a young man who, when the war ended, was just a teenager, but a few years later, influenced, I think, by a previous book, John Arndt's True Christianity, Jacob Spener said, no, Luther was right. He gave us the teaching, but das Lehre, but we need to add das Leben. He wrote a beautiful little book. Actually, it started out to be a preface of John Arndt's book, but it became a book published by itself called Pious Desires, or Pia Desideria. And he had basically 6 ideas to reform the church. I won't mention all 6, but the idea was you'd get into small groups and have Bible studies of lay people, and you'd have prayer, and you would focus on practical aspects of Christianity, not just theoretical. And you'd have pastors who would preach for conversion, the idea of being born again, and things like that. And that unleashed a reform in Germany, and also a great controversy, because he added subjectivity to Luther's objectivity. Luther's justification, God makes you righteous and declares you righteous, very important idea. Faith comes not by works, well, the works are the works of Jesus. We're saved by faith in Jesus' works. It's all by grace. But Luther really didn't develop the inner life, the sanctification. In fact, I think I could quote quite a few places where Luther didn't trust the inner life all that much. He really was so committed to an objective scripture idea. But Spener became the center of a movement called Pietism. And Pietism had a variety of incarnations, but it became an intermission movement in Germany and then spread to Scandinavia. This stake, I told my dad, well, I told my dad in my prayer because he's not alive, this was for him. This celebrates the kind of sturdy Norwegian Lutheranism that I was introduced to as a kid. It was passionately missionary, and it came out of a true belief in justification from Luther. Our church recited the Creed every Sunday, the Apostles' Creed. But we profoundly believed in also the obligation of witness, of taking seriously a personal faith. And so this is the Reform movement that spun out mission for the Protestants. So think of two Reform movements in the 18th century. Puritanism was kind of top down. You educate the clergy will reform the congregation. I call it top down reform. Very important, good idea. Jonathan Edwards, many other people are in that tradition. Pietism is bottom up reform. You get the lay people in small groups, warm-hearted Bible studies, and the reform percolates up from the bottom. So the 18th century is a wonderful opportunity for us to study how reform works and how both movements result in mission, and mission is different in each movement. There is no one way to follow Jesus, and there's no one way to reform the church. I'm grateful for all these movements. But Spener is very important. So the 17th stake represents the founding of Protestant missions as such. In fact, after Spener, it was Ziegenbalg and Franke, and then, of course, everybody knows about the Moravian brothers and Count Zinzendorf. Even Wesley came from England to be imbibed and to be strengthened and taught by these pietist brothers, and he carried that into the Wesleyan revival in England. So the pietist movement really is incredibly significant for modern world missions. And that's why I love to describe Spener and talk about the 30 Years' War and how mission was incubated in that context, and it set out to be inner mission, but it eventually became world mission. Okay, well, as you can probably see by now, everything on this trail comes downhill from the Reformation to the modern world, and we've come past the 17th stake of Spener and the Pietists, and we're coming now to what some say is the most surprising stake on this entire trail. We want to talk about the first missionaries ever to leave this place we call the United States. Now, when I grew up and when I studied missions and when I became an American Baptist, I was told, like everybody else, that the Judsons were the first missionaries who went off to India and went off to Burma eventually. And our whole denomination was founded on the idea that the New England Congregationalists and Baptists combined to send these folks overseas just after the War of 1812. And that's the dating of the American Baptist denomination. What I did not know was they were not, as it turns out, the first missionaries sent from the United States. I want to introduce them when we come to the next stake. It was about 1980, I went to the American Society of Missiology annual meeting. Missiology, by the way, is the study of and the strategy for the world mission of the church. Every year, those people of us who teach mission would gather at that conference. And I was at one such conference, and a friend of mine, Orlando Costas, said, "Hey, Ray, come meet Pearl McNeil." Well, I saw this very elegant-looking African-American woman with silver hair, very distinguished, very quiet. And I came over to meet her, and Orlando said, "Tell Ray what you're studying, what you're writing about, what you're learning." And so she said, "I'm studying George Liele." And I said, "How do you spell that?" And she said, "Well, Liele." And I said, "Forgive me, I don't remember George Liele." She said, "Well, I'm not surprised." She said, "Almost no one does know about him." But she had spent her life studying about him and about another man named David George. The story goes something like this. David George and George Liele were from the area of Savannah, Georgia, or Silver Creek, which is just outside Savannah in South Carolina. And the British in the American Revolution actually took control of that area for a while, for a few years, and the slaves of that area had some freedom that they didn't have when the Americans were in charge of the slaves. And so George Liele and David George started going all over the plantations preaching the gospel. And revival broke out among the slaves. And finally it was decided that they felt a call to foreign missions. And so, as it turns out, George Liele went off to Jamaica, where he founded what is today the Jamaican Baptist Convention. I actually last year went out there and was in the very church that he founded. That church has over 500 members. The roof had blown off in a recent storm, by the way, and they're putting it back on. But David George, on the other hand, went to Nova Scotia and then over to Africa. This was 22 years before the Judsons left for India and Burma. 22 years before the white Baptists in New England sent the white missionaries to Asia, the black slaves of Carolina and Georgia sent these two Africans off to foreign missions. This was a shock to many people who've taken a walk on this trail. I've done a lot of reading in the black histories, and you know, this story was known to Carter Woodson back in the 1920s. It was known to a number of black scholars. They didn't have much detail, but none of the white history books mentioned this at all. Until finally, in 1995, Mark Knoll, who was at Wheaton College then, but at Notre Dame now, finally gave 3 pages to these two black men. So we now know for sure that these two black men were the first missionaries ever sent from the United States, David George and George Lyle. And by the way, if you go down to the downtown of Savannah and look for First Baptist Church there, it's not the original building. In the original building, there were holes on the floor. There are holes in the floor of this building, but for a different reason. It lets the cold air come up through the basement, and it's sort of a simplified air conditioning system. But in those days, they put the commissioned missionaries under the floorboards, and in case they would be discovered by the plantation owners, they held their commissioning service over the top of them. So those holes are breathing holes, the holes in the floor of the original First Baptist Church. And then after the service was over, they smuggled these missionaries out down the Savannah River, where they took off across the ocean to become missionaries. A great story. And so I'm here to tell you, I have a black son, adopted son, and I have 2 black grandsons. And I say to them, this stake is for you. This is to remind you that the people who were forced to come here against their will on slave ships, against all odds, were the very first people to volunteer to get back on the ships, to go abroad to tell people about Jesus. Now, don't let anybody ever tell you that black people don't care about missions. It's not true. They invented world missions in the United States. As we move into the modern era, the 19th century, I want to introduce another aspect of mission, and that is politics. There was a group of evangelical Anglicans in England that had been influenced by Wesley's enthusiastic religion to take personal faith into public life, and one of them was a man named Earl Anthony Cooper, otherwise known as the 7th Earl Shaftesbury. A very famous man. He was born of wealth. At the age of 14, he was walking on a cobblestone street, and he saw 2 drunks with a wheelbarrow taking a body to a common grave, and the body was flopping up and down in the wheelbarrow, and when it hit a rock, the wheelbarrow flipped and the body fell in the street. And the young Shaftesbury was very emotional, and he watched these 2 drunks as they stood and laughed at the corpse. And he made a vow. He said, when I grow up, I'm going to change the way we bury people in England. And he did. He founded the cemetery reform movement and later got Parliament to pass that law. Shaftesbury was incredible. Can you believe it? The mine shafts were 18 inches wide in England. And so only children could get down the mine shafts to mine coal, and little boys and little girls would go down into the mine shafts with their little pickaxes and cut coal and hoist it up to the top where it'd be sold all through England. And Shaftesbury was in Parliament speaking to the owners of the mines, saying, you've got to change the mine shafts, you've got to widen them. They said, no, it's too expensive, we'll never compete with German coal. Well, you hear that argument all the time, but after 10 years they agreed. Then he took another 10 years to work on the 10 hours bill. Then the poor children came out of the mines. They had no schools to attend. The poor people never went to school in England, or anywhere else for that matter. Rich kids could go to school. They had private schools. They called them public, but they were private. Shaftesbury founded the Ragged School movement, which basically meant ragged children could wear ragged clothes to school. And he basically founded the first ever public school movement for common kids, so that they could learn to read. Oh, and he, by the way, he felt that they ought to be able to read the King James Bible, because he believed that in the end time, everybody's going to rise from their grave, and they have to give an account for their life. They should be able to read their indictment, which is the Bible. So the Bible became the reading standard for poor kids. But that wasn't all. He went to prison and visited the prisoners to preach on Sunday to the prisoners, as Jesus says in Matthew 25, and Wesley encouraged people to do. He was shocked to find mental victims were routinely tossed in prisons along with poor people and real criminals. He made a vow, because Shaftesbury had mental issues of his own. He ran a depression all his life. Sometimes he was so freaked out he could hardly function. He'd quit in the middle of a speech. He would disappear for weeks and come back weeks later and continue the speech, often in mid-sentence. And well, anyway, he came out of the prison and founded the first ever Christian mental health hospital in the history of the world that we know about. He saw a lot of people dying of cholera and typhus in the East End of London, and Dickens' London, you know, if you've read about it, it was terrible. And so he formed the London Water Board, took a verse from 1 Corinthians, and he literally drained swamps, and he invented a new kind of sewer system to put the sewers underground. Now, when the British East India Company went to India, they took those sewers with them. And each time I go to India, I'm seeing people bathe on the sidewalk. They're literally bathing in these 200-year-old sewers that were designed by Shaftesbury. When Shaftesbury died in 1885, Queen Victoria asked that the telegraph, which had just been invented a few years before, be used, and they sent a message to every ship on the Atlantic and every train in England with this message: shut down your engine, in honor of the man who had changed the world more than any other man since Jesus Christ. This is the testament of somebody who took personal faith into public life, which is also a mission field. What's especially poignant in his case for me is Georgina Battiscombe, one of his biographers, tells a story. This man who transformed England was not a well man. He wasn't easy to get along with, and he was mentally depressed most of his life. Sometimes he couldn't even function. And it's Shaftesbury's tenacity, however, which is legendary. And his biographer says, if he had been a healthy man, he probably wouldn't have spent 10 years trying to solve one little problem like 18-inch mine shafts. He'd probably moved on to something more doable. But because he had this mental issue, which today perhaps would be treated by psychiatrists and maybe some drugs, he was not treated then. This reminds me as a minister that I must be very careful about passing judgment on people who live with depression or live with mental challenges, because the man who changed the world was a man who was not healthy mentally, and that was Shaftesbury. I put him there at the 19th stake. For me, the preachers like Spurgeon in the 19th century or Shaftesbury, the politicians, belonged together. Without Shaftesbury, Spurgeon's congregation wouldn't have learned to read. So I still think that in modern cities, we need the powerful and the powerless. In my own family, this is true. I have a brother named Dennis whose call is to the powerful. He was Bill Clinton's golfing partner. And my call was clearly to the powerless. I affirmed Dennis's call to the powerful. Harvard MBA, he moved into the White House in management budget. He worked among the powerful so that he has friends like Colin Powell. God bless him. And bless those who, like Shaftesbury, are called to the powerful, because they have the levers to turn on behalf of the powerless. We have movements today and missions called business as mission. And it's very important. People take their call to the powerful to be resource developers, and so that's what we celebrate here at the 19th stake. We finally move into the 20th and early 21st century, the last stake on the mission trail is Teresa of Calcutta. Maybe you've detected a slight urban bias in my mission stories, but this one is certainly the case. Mother Teresa of Calcutta was an Albanian-born sister, and as a young girl growing up in Albania, her father died when she was 9, and in a basic Orthodox country, she was raised as a Catholic. She felt a call to mission as a teenager and joined the Sisters of Loreto and wanted immediately to go to India to be a teacher, but they sent her to Ireland to learn English. So she said, I'll give it a year. So she went to Ireland, and then she ended up going to India. And in 1937, actually 6 years after arriving in India and becoming a sister, she took her name, Teresa, and then became a teacher in Calcutta, as it was called then. It's called Kolkata today. Calcutta was a terrible place during Second World War, and especially after it, when India was going through the throes of independence to throw off the yoke of the British Empire, which they did. And Calcutta had race wars or religious wars between Muslims and Hindus, and Christians, of course, were often caught in the crossfire there. She decided to start another order, and she was given permission to do so, and she started the Sisters of Charity. I've chosen her for many reasons. I've visited her place. I've heard her speak. I've heard her say, I don't love the poor. I don't even know them. But when I see Jesus in the poor, it is not a service to take care of the poor, it's an act of worship. That literally transposes the whole idea of ministry for me. She also reminds me that about 70% of all of the cross-cultural or mission workers of the world are not men, they're women. And they're often in the toughest places on the planet, and that's certainly true for Teresa of Calcutta. Mother Teresa, of course, has been working with the dying, and she said those who die ought to die as an angel. Because they lived in corruption, they should die with dignity. And she worked among the deaf and the dying. She developed an enormous affinity for unwanted children and abandoned kids and broken, battered bodies of kids. And so today, the Sisters of Charity are running nurseries of HIV and impacted kids that I have visited in Africa and in Asia especially. I really admire the Sisters of Charity. And so I've chosen Teresa of Calcutta, or Teresa of Kolkata, to be my saint for the 20th stake here, representing the century. She died a few days after Princess Diana, died in a car wreck. Everybody knows about Princess Di's death, but she was given a state funeral by the Hindu government. She's been honored very much. If you go to her, the headquarters of the Sisters on Lower Circular Road, as I did when I visited last with my class a couple years ago, you see her in a sculpture sitting there as though she's still in prayer with the sisters who meet there every single day before they go off to work. Well, we started with Barnabas of Cyprus. We've come through 20 centuries of mission. We've seen that Catholics and Orthodox and Protestants have combined to take the gospel cross oceans, cross jungles, and now in the 20th century, the Lord God of mission is bringing the jungles across the oceans, and they're settling in the cities of the world. And so my burden has been that the world mission today is no longer geographically distant, it's culturally distant. This trail comes to an end, but I want to tell you that I've just written a book on the trail, a little more than 200 pages, and in that book, which I call A Surprising Journey, I also take in depth the stories you've heard and add a few more. There are etchings in there, there are maps in there, and sketches, but also bibliography. Most of my doctoral students, and I have about 400 of them in about 40 countries all over the world today, they study in Chinese and French and Spanish, Portuguese and English, and some in Arabic. And I just want them to be able to get this feel of passion that mission is not just something we do. It was started by God, commissioned by Christ, and we continue the mission. And we're in partnerships, even as the Trinity was in a partnership. And, you know, I believe the Holy Spirit was active in all 20 centuries. So for me, this trail is an act of worship. It's an act also for me of sustainable spirituality. I celebrate the memory. I think it was St. Augustine long ago who said that for the Christian, the past is a present memory. The future is a present possibility. So the Christian lives simultaneously in 3 time zones. I celebrate that. And so the mission trail takes me deeply into the taproot of the church and mission, and it does nothing less than compel me to go forward, and to go forward expecting the Holy Spirit's out there before I get there. That I've learned that on the trail, and I'm glad you were able to take this walk with me on this beautiful morning. For those of you who don't know the geography, we're very close to the Canadian border. We're surrounded by mountains. We're 3 miles from the little rural farm that I grew up in. My spiritual gifts, I used to say, were milking cows and logging. Not much use for those gifts anymore. But I grew up in this valley, and people poured their lives into us and into me, and taught me that I should love God and serve the world, and if anything possible, we should be focused on mission. And I hope I've had a chance to share some of that with you today. Thank you, and God